went to Afghanistan briefly with Kathy's group, with Voices for Creative Nonviolence, which is a wonderful peace organization out of Chicago. And they've been bringing Americans and Australians and Europeans and international peace activists to Afghanistan for weeks and months, for years now, and have gotten to know a lot of people. Even so, and certainly with my visits, you get a very intense view of a very small, non-scientific sampling of Afghans, and so you learn things and opinions and views you had no idea of, but then you don't know if that represents 2% or 80% of Afghanistan. But I'm very, very glad I went. Just the experience of going to this incredibly impoverished place, flying on an airplane where I'm sure 80% of the people on the airplane are mercenaries for the U.S. military. Including the plane from Washington to Dubai that I flew on, and then the one from Dubai to Kabul, it's all mercenaries and soldiers. It's less a civilian transport than the Lusitania was. And you get over there, and there's very little appearance that we or anybody else is providing anything other than violence. You can't breathe the air, you can't drink the water, you can't walk on the streets. It's not, the people are wonderful. The people are amazingly upbeat and positive and welcoming and friendly and hospitable, but it's a terrible place, and we're not doing what we ought to be doing to fix it, which would cost far less money than what we're doing to continue the violence. I went over there, with the understanding that some Americans have of what our role has been. Going in there in 1979, provoking the Soviet Union to come in, arming the Mujahideen through that and into a civil war, abandoning the place for a horrible civil war, and ending up with these terrorist groups created and funded with our support, and then going back in and bombing and occupying and building bases. We're still building shiny new bases all over the place, and there's not much indication of leaving, and kicking in doors and bombing civilians and shooting children out of helicopters. And just before I went over there, photographs come out of this U.S. military kill team, as they called themselves, shooting Afghans for sport and posing with the corpses. Just before I went over there, Afghanistan became enraged over a preacher in Florida burning a Koran. While I was over there, people became enraged over U.S. and NATO convoys running people over, night raids, kidnapping and killing people, bombs and missiles killing people, and there were all sorts of nonviolent and violent reactions to all of this. And so it was a period where the international aid workers, the people who are there risking their lives and in some cases losing their lives, trying to provide clean water and so forth, are afraid to go outdoors. And so, Kabul University is holding a rally against the U.S. occupation. Normally I would go and speak against my own government and on behalf of 2/3 of my own people, and yet I'm told you just can't. You'll be killed for being an American. And so I was interested in how Afghans viewed things, and just about across the board, they wouldn't trust the United States military as far as they could throw it. They don't believe we're there for humanitarian goodwill. That being said, some of them believe the U.S. military is better than the Taliban, and some of them don't, and some of them want everybody out immediately. And of course, the U.S. military propaganda there, as here, is be very afraid of the Taliban. And people are traumatized and have been traumatized by violence of all sorts, by warlords of various flavors that we funded in previous decades and the ones we're funding now. And many people, nobody's seen peace. Many people can't imagine peace. And it seems to be the young people, more than anything, who can sort of picture what peace might be like and imagine that it might be possible. Which is good because most Afghans are young people. More than two-thirds of the country is under 25. The life expectancy, in fact, is not very good. It's a very young country. Just before I went over there, I went to UVA and spoke with a man who was speaking there named Johan Galtung, who's often called the father of peace studies, who's been mediating conflicts and teaching peace for decades. And his prescription for Afghanistan included, a loose confederation with other nations in the area of Pakistan and Iran. And yet, if you go and talk with, again, a very small, unscientific sample in the capital city, people are as resentful of interference by Iran or Pakistan as by the United States or NATO or the Taliban or anybody else. And which is not to say that building regional confederations is not the way to go. I mean, Galtung wants that for North America too, and you can talk to Americans and they would say, hell no. But if you ask Afghans, you get a certain viewpoint which tends to lean toward, when in the world do we get to say what happens to our country? Right? Here you are paying the Taliban off to drive down roads, funding the Taliban not to shoot you, putting millions of dollars into luxurious peace conferences in the United Arab Emirates, where this illegal foreign occupier is negotiating power sharing with these previous religious fanatics who we consider criminals. And reconciliation and forgiveness would be one thing, but putting them in power, when we aren't at the table, or the Afghan people aren't represented at the table, just our puppet government, your warlords and the other warlords, and so there's a desire for sovereignty on behalf of the Afghans that you just don't hear that much in the conversations here. There was a conference in DC today that I was watching live stream on my computer where you had all these, impressive liberals, that is to say, primarily war-supporting liberals, although there were a few like Matthew Hope, who resigned from this war, who were pretty good. And then you had Ann Coulter come up to speak. And she's trashing the war on Afghanistan and tying herself in knots and accidentally denouncing the war on Iraq, which she was supposed to think was the good one. And yet her argument that all the liberals support this crazy war in Afghanistan looks right inside Washington, D.C., even though almost everybody who calls themselves a liberal, and in fact two-thirds of the country outside of Washington, D.C., want out of there. So you have different perspectives depending where you're sitting. I met a lot of very, very smart people. In Kabul, you meet a lot of people who are educated and literate and have traveled, and I met artists and filmmakers, and we're putting together an Afghan film festival for this country for the fall with some of these filmmakers. One woman showed us a film she made called Afghan Women Behind the Wheel, which you can find at that website, Afghan Women Behind the Wheel, about women daring to drive cars in Afghanistan. That was very good. We met with all kinds of leading Afghans and foreigners, with newspaper editors. We met with Ramazan Bashardost, whom Kathy mentioned briefly, who came in third running for president. You can watch a long video interview with him on my website. He is a believer in Gandhian nonviolent struggle, but he's a politician, he's an insider, he's a member of parliament, and he's a good ally for people to have in Afghanistan. And he should have been in a runoff with Karzai if they had followed the Constitution in the election. But most importantly, I think we met with a group called Afghan Youth Peace Volunteers, which is a group of young men mostly and young women and boys and girls who are organizing nonviolent campaigns for peace. That is rallies and protests where you don't have to be afraid you're going to get killed because someone's going to get out of control, but advocacy for peace. And they have an entire agenda that they're pushing short-term and long-term, including getting the U.S. out immediately, getting a team of international peacekeepers for a transition, building a legitimate government in Afghanistan. But there's a lot of work to do, organizing the young, empowering the women who are going to have to be part of anything that happens in Afghanistan, and unifying across ethnic lines. It's such a divided country by ethnicity. But several years ago, when people were working to do this in Egypt and Tunisia and elsewhere, and nobody said it could be done, people did it. And we ought to be offering the same counseling and organizing and any resources that are useful and acceptable in terms of building nonviolent pressure in Afghanistan rather than bombing the place. We ought to be providing sewers and water. We ought to be providing electricity and communications rather than just killing in Afghanistan. And there are small organizations. I know there's been this big scandal with Greg Mortensen's possibly quite corrupt organization, but I doubt his corruption could possibly match the corruption of the U.S. military and the Afghan government. There are small organizations in Afghanistan, some of them started here and elsewhere, but working with people on the ground in Afghanistan that are legitimately doing good with money, with virtually no money compared to what's going into the war. So we're at a point where all of the lies about the Iraq war have been transferred over to Afghanistan. All of the lies about the surge, the escalation in Iraq, benefiting Iraq and bringing down the violence in Iraq, and the conditions that actually made that happen just don't apply in Afghanistan. We had a surge last year that made things worse. We had a surge the year before that made things worse. We've surged 60,000, 70,000 troops since we got our Peace Prize winning president in, and we have a commitment from him to start the withdrawal this July. That is to say, bring at least one person, maybe 10,000, who knows, out of Afghanistan. I think it ought to be at least the 60,000, 70,000 that he's put in, which would legitimate referring to that as a surge. If they stay forever, it's not what they call a surge. And I think that the demands of peace groups should at least keep pace with the U.S. public, a majority of which says get everybody out of there this year. That ought to be our demand on Washington. And I don't care if crazy right-wingers who make no sense and call everybody names want to get out of there because Obama's black or because it costs money. I want to get out of there. And most people want to get out of there for a combination of reasons that include the right ones. That we're killing people, that we're destroying prospects for peace and the rule of law, and we're entrenching a cycle of violence that most people in Afghanistan can't envision any way out of. I want to stop talking and have a discussion with plenty of time for questions, which we don't usually do, and I welcome any questions about any wars or about why wars are all based on lies, or about how you can visit Afghanistan, or anything else. Randon.
I'm just curious, is there any way for Voices for Creative Nonviolence to converse with anybody in Washington about their trips over there, the stuff they've learned, things like that? Or is it basically just talking to the public? Or is there a chance of meeting with, the president, say, for example, or UN representative?
Last week, an organization called Power Shift that favors renewable energy took 10,000 young people and started doing sit-ins and raising hell and marching through Washington, and they were able to get a meeting with the president, at which he told them, go out there and make me do it. And I doubt very much any of them believed a word of it. But regardless, that is the right answer. Get out there and make them do it. I don't know how much good meeting with the president will do. You can watch a video on my website of Carl Eikenberry, ambassador to Afghanistan, telling the Afghan youth peace volunteers that he will deliver their letter personally to Barack Obama. You can watch another video of Congressman Keith Ellison saying the same thing. There are people who have promised to stay involved and to carry the message to the president, among others. But I think, until we can apply serious pressure to Congress, we're not likely to get anywhere. People sort of hear, you mean 2/3 of Americans oppose the war in Afghanistan and want to cut and run, and they're all a bunch of cowards? I thought that was just a handful of hippies. It's 2/3 of America? Well, then why isn't Congress doing it? As if this were some sort of freak, incident where, I cannot think of any issue of any sort where Congress and the president aren't doing something radically different from what the majority of Americans want. That's the norm. And unless you can apply the kind of pressure that we have not yet built, have not been able to bring, actually shutting down buildings, actually interfering with what they do, actually breaking voters of the lock of the two parties, even at the risk of electing the worst person one time. Then I don't know, how much good talking to the president does. The president gave a speech last week, or was it the week before, about budget issues. That if you sifted through the rhetoric, some of which was nice, and looked at the policy proposals, it was just awful. It was just drive the nation off the cliff and take the rest of the world with it. And because he spent so much time bashing Republicans and had a little bit of nice rhetoric in there, people tended to love it. So getting the president to say something, would actually convince millions of Americans that he had done something. I'm more interested in getting something done.
How hard was it for you to get into Afghanistan? And, how hard is it for an American to go to Afghanistan? It's not part of the military. And while you were there, did you have an escort? Were you limited, by the American military to a specific place and to specific people that you could talk to?
The Voices for Creative Nonviolence worked with a group in Kabul called the Open Society, which is an Afghan group that has no connection whatsoever to George Soros's Open Society. And they put my name and everybody else's name on an invitation letter and invited us to come visit Afghanistan. And so we took that to the consulate, to the embassy in Washington, and asked for a visa. And they said, sure, come back in 2 days, and I came back in 2 days, and it wasn't ready. But I got the visa, and once you have a visa, you just buy a plane ticket and go. As far as getting around safely, everybody has different standards. There are people who who could not look at Afghan to save their lives, who are happy to ride a bicycle around town all night and no worries. There are other people and organizations and institutions and the United Nations that will refuse to allow people out of doors, at least on days that are deemed particularly dangerous. We stayed at a guest house that was in a neighborhood that had armed checkpoints and had armed guards at the door, and we could go out anytime we wanted, but we were severely warned on particular mornings that this is not a day when you want to go outside if you want to stay alive. And then, so you had to, I got an Afghan hat, I got an Afghan scarf, we rode in cars, we didn't walk around, but you take a certain level of risk, and nobody told me I couldn't go anywhere, and nobody escorted me around, and I didn't have any contact with the U.S. military. But it's a place where you can very easily get a little bit of a taste of how really traumatizing it has to be to live in a war, because we don't fight these wars in some neutral football field somewhere, and we don't fight them here. We fight them in people's towns for years, and they live with it. It's just in the other country, not our country. Yes?
Why do you think, this is probably a stupid question, why do you think Congress and the President are ignoring the majority of Americans and not doing anything about getting us out of Afghanistan? Why do you think we're there?
Yeah.
Why do you think the government and powers that be want us there?
Yeah, it's kind of two questions, kind of one question. If you couldn't hear, the question is why is the U.S. government there, and why is the U.S. government, Congress, and the President not listening to the will of the American people? And again, they don't listen to the will of the American people on any issue, so this is not an exception. And the broad reasons for that, of course, include that they are bought and paid for, that we don't have any decent communication system, that we have these two parties controlling Congress members rather than their constituents controlling them, and all of the ways in which our government has been completely corrupted. But on this issue of why they want to be there, the reasons they gave, just like the reasons they're giving on Libya and have given on every war since the beginning of wars, don't make any sense. We're going there somehow to impose justice on those who were complicit in 9/11, even though the Taliban, both before and after 9/11 and before the bombs hit, and right as the bombs were about to hit, were ready to turn bin Laden over to be put on trial. And our president wasn't interested in that. He wanted to have a war. But assuming then that the goal is to overturn the Taliban, that was accomplished very, very quickly. And if the goal was to chase Al-Qaeda out of the country, that was accomplished very, very quickly. And there didn't seem to be a lot of interest in pursuing Al-Qaeda so much as in occupying Afghanistan and building bases and building a permanent presence. And from the start, there has been a goal by the U.S. and NATO to put weapons into Afghanistan, including nuclear weapons. Afghanistan is very centrally located on the chessboard of global military strategy. And there has been a goal quite openly. One of the major reasons from the start has been to put a natural gas pipeline through Afghanistan. Many of these wars are largely about resources, not specifically about letting Americans pay less for their gas, or even about getting the profits to American corporations, but at least about the United States controlling the resources rather than anybody else, rather than China controlling the natural resources in that area, or Libya controlling its own natural resources, or anything of the sort. But there's a lot of profiteering. There's endless corruption in our public government and in our government and in our military. A lot of people are getting rich from this war. A lot of people want to keep it going. You have to use the weapons to make more weapons. It's beyond that, there are clearly irrational, power-lusting, machismo drives for war that motivate powerful people in our government. And you look back through wars that we fought, including Vietnam, where they've just decided they're going to escalate this war, and then they have to figure out why. Why for their own understanding, and then why to tell the public, which is like a third operation. But the war is just going to happen, and there's political calculations. I'm sure that the kind of people who advise Obama and the kind of person Obama is are thinking, you can't lose a war. You can't be the president who loses a war. Johnson and Nixon both lost the White House by refusing to be the guy who loses the war, right? We got 2/3 of the country saying, lose this damn war already. But the way that these people think is all about power and credibility. We're bombing Libya. The Justice Department gave Congress basically 2 reasons why it's in our national interest to be bombing Libya. One is for regional stability, right? Raise your hand if you think the United States and Libya are in the same region. And the other is to protect the credibility of the United Nations, right? And that doesn't mean respect for the United Nations, whose special rapporteur we won't allow to see Bradley Manning, and we're now shipping him out of Virginia to Leavenworth so he can't get close to him. And, this is the same United Nations that in 2003 we went into Iraq despite its opposition explicitly, among other reasons, in order to make the United Nations irrelevant, right? It's about credibility in the language of war makers is about making war. And the more war you make, the more damage you do, the more credible you are. And so that's what they mean, I think, by the credibility of the United Nations. Do you have a question?
Yeah, please. You said 2/3 of the Americans are against the war in Afghanistan. I didn't realize it was that high, and I believe you. But what reasons? I have 2 questions. One is, what reasons do the American people say we should be out of Afghanistan? Because I ask that because I don't see a lot of action on the ground, voicing their concerns about it. Number, even younger people, my impression, I could be wrong, are much more interested in issues of ecology than peace at this time. That's my impression. So the second question is, how would you organize people from below? Those voices are heard and they can't be not heard by our so-called government people.
Well, that's a huge question, which we could discuss for hours and hours. But I think that the short answer is, there's a good website, pollingreport.com, that collects polls on all kinds of issues, and you can click on Afghanistan and see a lot of the corporate polling on Afghanistan, and it is pretty consistently 60, 65, 70% of people, not just I dislike it or I oppose it or I think it was a bad idea, but I want to end it. I want to end it this year. And that doesn't mean they're going to lift a finger. That just means that they're going to tell the pollster that. And it's a world of difference. I mean, we only need 1% of the country to act properly, and we could actually end the war in Afghanistan. Why do people oppose it? A lot of reasons. Among them, the financial cost. Among them, the fact that it's the longest war, depending how you measure Vietnam, that the United States has ever been in. There's no clear end in sight. All of the experts say it's hopeless. This thing in D.C. today with all of these liberal war hawks, most of them talking their expertise. A friend of mine and of many of ours in this room probably, who's got family here and has been here a number of times, Ray McGovern, stood up and said, I used to chair the National Intelligence Estimates for years, and he did. And there were 2 last year. There was one on Afghanistan that said we cannot possibly get anywhere without help from Pakistan. And there was one on Pakistan that said we're not possibly going to get any help from Pakistan on anything. These are not General Petraeus spouting off, our famous spokes general. These were the 16 so-called intelligence agencies getting together and pooling their information and saying, here's what we think the facts are, supposedly. And so when you have all the when you have all the experts saying it's hopeless, when you have the peace movement saying it's hopeless, when you have people on the right, for whatever crazy reasons, because the president's in the wrong party now, or for more serious reasons, saying get out of there, you end up with 2/3 at least saying, if not doing anything about it, we ought to get out of it. How do we get them to do something about it is a whole different question, and to what extent there is a peace movement doing something about it is another question. You know, on April 9th, there was a big march in New York City. On April 10th, there was a big march in San Francisco. There was not a single story in the corporate media about either one. And yet, within a few days, there was this whole wave of stories and articles and columns about where's the peace movement? Now that the president's a Democrat, the peace movement has gone away. And of course, the peace movement did largely go away. In November 2008, the big organizations were completely defunded. 80% of peace activists shut down. The Democratic Party loyal groups, the MoveOn.orgs of the world that had only protested in Republican districts anyway, so you could sort of see what was coming, had been pretending to oppose wars for years and didn't oppose wars anymore. And yet, there remained a core of thousands and thousands of peace activists who were still pushing hard, and yet what little corporate media coverage there had been, which had always persuaded everybody that we were smaller than we thought than we were, just dropped off completely. And so there's a combination of factors here. That there are people of all ages who are far more active than we know. And the obvious solution to that is to build our own media. If we could convince some of the people with money to sit out one election, to not dump their money into another election and instead put it into independent media, then we could know what was happening in this country from here on out. We also, of course, have to build more independent, more militant movements. And the labor movement is dying. And until we have a living wage campaign at UVA that's been going since the mid-90s, and we went today and we marched around a building 3 times. But we didn't march in it, and we didn't sit down.
Or take the streets.
Huh?
Or take the streets.
We didn't block the streets, we didn't take over anyone's house or anyone's office or stop anything happening. For the past 30 years, the labor movement in this country has refused to use the tool that it has to use to succeed. It's had PR stunts, it's had pickets, it's had these soft approaches that have won some victories, but in the grand scheme, the thing is dying. The force that could impose the will of non-billionaires on the misrepresentatives in government is dying because they won't strike and stop the businesses. And until you can throw that monkey wrench into the machine, until you can actually impose some pain on the people who are imposing all the pain in the world, persuasion just doesn't get you there. Yeah, you have to talk to people too. Yeah, you have to avoid anger and hatred and animosity and be open to people changing. But you have to have pressure. When the Yes Men and US Uncut last week put out a phony press release that General Electric had a change of heart and was going to pay all of its billions of dollars of back taxes, and then General Electric had to come out and say, they're kidding, we aren't really doing that. GE's stock had plummeted, and then it shot back up, right? All of the mechanisms that drive these corporations' behavior, and everybody now works for the corporations, are rigged towards evil behavior, right? And until there's a force that pushes the other way, we can have all the arguments and all the morality and all the evidence and not get anywhere. And so, we do have to march, and we do have to educate, and we do have to lobby, and we do have to send emails, but we have to do some more than that too.